Welcome to the deep dive, where we take these complex topics and we kind of try to break them down, make them a little more accessible.
Yeah.
Today we're diving into thinking the 20th century.
Okay.
It's a really interesting conversation between Tony Judt, who's a historian, and Timothy Snyder.
Mm-hmm.
And basically think of it as like a crash course on all those big ideas that shaped the 20th century.
Right, yeah. And it's not just like a dry, textbook on the 20th century. I mean, it's really like a journey through Jut's own life.
Yeah.
And how all these different experiences he had kind of shaped his view of history.
Yeah. And I mean, you really get a sense of that, like insider-outsider perspective that he brings, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, so just imagine, growing up in post-war England, right? Like the shadow of the Holocaust is still like very much present.
Right.
And then, he immerses himself in like French intellectual circles.
Right.
He's hanging out with socialists and all these thinkers. And then, fast forward a bit, he finds himself in Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
Specifically Poland, right as the communist system is collapsing.
Wow.
So, I mean, each one of these experiences just gives him this like really unique vantage point.
Totally.
To like see the complexities of the 20th century,
Yeah.
in a way that a lot of other people might have missed.
It's kind of amazing how his own like personal journey kind of like mirrors the themes that he ends up exploring in the book.
Right, totally, yeah. And one of the like most powerful ideas in the book is this concept of living in truth, which is something that Judt saw firsthand in Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
He was like really fascinated by these dissidents like Václav Havel.
Right.
These were people who were basically like challenging these oppressive regimes just by choosing to live authentically.
So just by like being themselves.
Yeah. By refusing to like conform to all the lies and propaganda. So for them, like being authentic, living truthfully became like a form of resistance.
Yeah.
Like it was this quiet but really profound rebellion against the system. And, by doing this, by choosing to live in truth, they exposed how like hollow this ideology was. And they chipped away at its legitimacy. I mean, it's such a powerful reminder that even when you're facing like overwhelming power, individual acts of integrity can have these huge political consequences.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because Judd, he doesn't shy away from like really dissecting ideologies that like to us today seem like pretty repellent, like Marxism, fascism.
Yeah, no, totally. And what's really interesting is he doesn't just like condemn them outright.
Yeah.
He actually delves into their intellectual roots, He explores like how they resonated with people who were grappling with all the anxieties and uncertainties of modernity.
Yeah.
So, for example, he highlights how like in the early 20th century, Marxism offered this really compelling narrative of progress and social justice. Right, yeah.
And this was especially appealing in a world that was like struggling with massive economic inequalities and all this social unrest.
Yeah, it's so easy to judge like historical figures from where we are now, but I mean, it's so important to understand that context.
Totally, absolutely.
Yeah, right.
And Judd does a great job of that. He also delves into like the intellectual side of fascism, which like we don't always talk about that, right? We often just focus on like the violence and the brutality.
Yeah.
But he explores how it provided this sense of belonging and national identity, especially in countries that were like struggling with the aftermath of World War I and like all the anxieties of modernization. It offered this like seductive vision of restoring national pride and strength.
So, I mean, both Marxism and fascism, even though they're like so different, in a way they were offering answers to these like real anxieties that people were feeling at the time. Exactly. Yeah. Like they thrived because they offered these seemingly compelling solutions to these complex problems.
Yeah.
And Judt really forces us to like confront this uncomfortable reality that even dangerous ideologies can have an intellectual appeal.
Yeah. And I mean, Judt seems like particularly interested in the role of intellectuals during all this.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. He's like wrestling with these ethical dilemmas that intellectuals faced under totalitarian regimes. Like, what compromises did they make?
Right.
And, how did their ideas, whether they were supporting or opposing the regime, how did those ideas impact society? He asks us to like consider these really difficult choices they faced. Do they collaborate? Do they resist? Or do they just stay silent?
Right.
He forces us to confront like the moral gray areas of history.
Yeah.
And think about what we might have done in their shoes.
And it feels like his own story, moving between these different intellectual and political landscapes, it kind of informs how he understands those figures, right?
Oh, for sure. It gives him this unique empathy, I think.
Yeah.
And this actually leads us to one of Judd's central themes in the book, which is this idea of social democracy.
Yeah.
And its importance in creating a just and equitable society.
I mean, this is like an ideology that he seems to really like champion throughout the book.
Oh, absolutely. Judd, he passionately believed in the power of social democracy. He traces it from its roots in like Victorian England all the way through its successes and its challenges in the post-war era. And he argues that social democracy, with its emphasis on things like social justice, economic fairness, a strong social safety net, all of that stuff, remains incredibly relevant today, especially in a world where we're seeing like rising economic anxieties and the dismantling of welfare states.
Right. So he saw it as like kind of an antidote to like both the excesses of capitalism, but also the dangers of like full-blown authoritarianism.
Exactly. Yeah. He saw it as this middle ground, this path towards a more just and equitable society that balances individual liberty with a commitment to social responsibility.
Yeah.
And he was really fascinated by how social democratic ideas took on these different forms in different countries, you know, like how it played out in Britain versus France or Scandinavia, for example.
Yeah. And it sounds like, I mean, he really believed that we need to understand history so we don't, you know, repeat those same mistakes.
Absolutely, yeah. Judd, he emphasizes the critical importance of historical understanding. Like, he warns us about the dangers of forgetting the lessons of the past.
Right.
And he's actually pretty critical of what he saw as this trend in academia towards, like, deconstruction and fragmentation, where historical narratives are kind of picked apart, but without offering any alternative explanations.
Oh, interesting.
He argues that this leaves people feeling, like, unmoored from the past and kind of ill-equipped to deal with the complexities of the present. He believed that we need narratives, stories that help us make sense of the past,
right,
to understand the forces that shaped our world and to guide us in the present.
It seems like for him, understanding history wasn't just some intellectual exercise. It was actually like vital for building a better future.
Exactly. It wasn't just about knowing dates and names. It was about understanding how the past shapes who we are and the choices we make.
Right.
Just believe that a healthy society needs to critically engage with its history.
Yeah.
Both the good and the bad. He urges us to, like, confront these uncomfortable truths, to learn from those mistakes, and then use those lessons to create a more just and humane future.
And I mean, you can see that in his own life and work.
Oh, absolutely. He was deeply engaged with the moral and ethical dimensions of history.
Yeah.
Like, he wasn't afraid to ask these really tough questions about responsibility, complicity, the choices people made. He doesn't just present facts. He probes the motivations, the consequences of those actions, and really urges us to think. How would we have acted in those situations?
Yeah.
He forces us to confront, like, the complexity of human behavior and all those gray areas that, you know, often define historical events.
So thinking the 20th century, it's more than just a history book.
Right.
It's like a journey through the mind of one of the most insightful historians of our time. And it'll challenge your assumptions, make you think, leave you with this like deeper understanding of, well, everything that shaped the 20th century and honestly still impacts us today.
Yeah, totally. It's a must read for anyone who really wants to understand how we got to where we are now.
We've only just scratched the surface here, you know. Yeah. In the next part of our deep dive, we're going to get into Jutt's analysis of the appeal of Marxism, his kind of evolving views on Israel, and his like really powerful argument for social democracy.
Yeah, we'll delve deeper into his perspective, his critiques of some kind of current intellectual trends, and his belief in the power of ideas to shape the world.
It's going to be a good one.
You know, one thing that's really interesting is Jutt's analysis of Marxism.
Yeah.
He doesn't just like dismiss it as this like failed ideology or whatever.
Right.
He really goes deep into like its intellectual and emotional appeal.
Yeah.
Particularly for like young intellectuals in the early 20th century.
Yeah. He even admits to being drawn to it himself.
Oh, totally. Yeah. He talks about how, you know, in a time of like massive upheaval, Marxism offered this like seemingly coherent explanation for all the injustices of capitalism.
Right.
And this vision of a more just and equitable future.
Yeah.
And this was like especially seductive after World War I.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
You know, with all the devastation and disillusionment with traditional political systems.
Totally. But he eventually kind of became disillusioned with it, right?
Yeah, he did.
Especially after seeing like actually existing communism in Eastern Europe.
Yeah, his experiences in Eastern Europe, especially with those dissidents who had suffered under communist regimes, really exposed that gap between Marxist theory and the brutal realities of how it was actually implemented.
Yeah.
He saw firsthand how the pursuit of a utopian vision could lead to totalitarian oppression,
Right.
crushing individual liberty and stifling dissent.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff.
Yeah, it really is. And it profoundly shaped his understanding of the dangers of ideological extremism and the importance of protecting individual rights and freedoms.
It seems like even though he was disillusioned, he didn't like completely reject the questions that Marxism was trying to answer.
Right, exactly. He rejected the solutions, but he still recognized that the questions about power, inequality, the nature of capitalism, those were all still important, you know, for understanding the challenges of modernity and for working towards a better society.
So it wasn't just about like throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Exactly.
It was more nuanced than that.
Yeah.
It seems like Judt also really challenges this idea that we can easily categorize historical figures as like purely good or purely evil.
Yeah, he really pushes back against those simplistic judgments.
Yeah.
He dives into like the complexities of their motivations, the dilemmas they faced, the consequences of their actions. You know, he wants us to see them as products of their time, grappling with difficult choices and uncertain circumstances.
Yeah.
And this nuanced approach, I think, is what makes his work so thought-provoking.
Oh, sure.
And also deeply humane.
And one of the most like striking examples of this is his relationship with Israel.
Oh, absolutely. His perspective on Israel is so personal.
Yeah.
And it really reflects his own like intellectual and emotional journey. As a young man, he was drawn to those early Zionist ideals.
Yeah.
You know, he saw Israel as this beacon of hope after the Holocaust. But as he got older and saw the realities of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, his views evolved.
Right.
He became more critical of Israeli policies, especially towards the Palestinians. And he really advocated for that two-state solution to ensure the rights and security of both Israelis and Palestinians.
And this got him in some hot water, right?
Oh, yeah. His criticisms of Israeli policies, especially things like the occupation of the Palestinian territories, led to accusations of disloyalty and even anti-Semitism.
Wow.
But, you know, he stood by his beliefs. He believed that true support for Israel meant holding it accountable to the same moral standards as any other nation.
That's a powerful stance.
It is, and it takes courage.
And it seems like that commitment to principle really runs through all of his work.
Absolutely. He refused to be silenced or intimidated by people who disagreed with him.
Yeah.
He believed in open and honest debate, even when it was uncomfortable or controversial. He saw intellectual honesty as a moral imperative, and he never backed down from speaking truth to power.
It was pretty inspiring.
Yeah, it is.
And it's not like he presents himself as this perfect person who has all the answers.
No, not at all. He acknowledges his own intellectual evolution, his changing views, his past mistakes even.
Yeah.
And that humility, I think, makes his work all the more compelling.
Totally relatable, too.
Absolutely. It reminds us that intellectual growth is a lifelong process.
Yeah.
It's about constantly questioning, reevaluating, revising our understanding of the world.
And it seems like that journey ultimately led him to this, like, passionate defense of social democracy.
Yes, it did.
As a way to create a more just and equitable society.
He saw social democracy as this system that could balance individual liberty with social responsibility, ensuring that the benefits of economic growth are shared more widely and that all citizens have access to essential things like healthcare, education, a decent standard of living.
Yeah.
He traced the evolution of those ideas from the 19th century through the 20th, arguing that they were still essential for addressing the challenges of the 21st century.
And he was especially critical of like unfettered capitalism and the rise of neoliberalism.
Yeah, he believed that neoliberalism's emphasis on deregulation, privatization, market-based solutions had led to widening inequality, the erosion of social safety nets, and a decline in social trust.
And a lot of people were saying those same things today.
His concerns about social democracy seem particularly relevant now.
Yeah, for sure.
Given the rise of populism and disillusionment with traditional political systems.
Almost like he was predicting what's happening now.
In a way, yeah. His analysis of those challenges facing social democracy provides a really valuable framework for understanding the political and social currents of our time.
So it's not just a historical analysis, it's relevant for today.
Exactly. He argues that social democracy needs to adapt to globalization, technological change, the increasing diversity of modern societies.
And what does he say it should adapt to?
He calls for a renewed commitment to social justice, economic fairness, and a strong social safety net to ensure that the benefits of progress are shared more widely, and that all citizens have the opportunity to live in dignity and security.
It's a pretty powerful vision.
It is.
And Judt's life and work really show us that the 20th century wasn't just this series of events.
Yeah.
It was like this crucible where ideas were forged, tested, reshaped.
Absolutely. He invites us to engage with those intellectual currents, to grapple with their complexities, and to consider their relevance for our own time.
And thinking the 20th century is really like this incredible journey.
It is.
Through the mind of one of the most insightful historians of our time.
It'll challenge you, provoke you, inspire you to think more deeply about the world around you. One of the things that makes thinking the 20th century so engaging, I think, is it's not your typical history book.
Yeah.
It's like structured as this series of conversations.
Oh, right. Between Judt and Timothy Snyder.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that format really creates this sense of intimacy, you know?
Yeah, like you're eavesdropping on them.
Totally, yeah. Like you're just listening in on this conversation between these two brilliant minds.
And it's definitely a lot more accessible than, those dense academic books.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's a breath of fresh air.
Yeah.
Compared to that kind of like dry academic prose.
Right.
And, Snyder's questions are really good too.
Yeah.
They're carefully crafted to like draw out Judt's insights and get him to reflect on his own journey.
So you get a real sense of like his personality.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
It's not just like this disembodied voice, You hear his passions, his frustrations as he's grappling with all these complexities.
And I think that makes the history come alive in a way that you wouldn't get from a regular textbook.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that conversational style allows for a much more nuanced exploration.
Yeah.
You see Judt wrestling with those ambiguities, revising his views, acknowledging that he doesn't have all the answers.
Right. And that makes him even more trustworthy in a way.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, that humility is really refreshing.
And it seems like one of Judt's biggest concerns was this idea of historical amnesia.
Oh, yeah. He was really worried about that. He believed that forgetting the lessons of the past basically dooms us to repeat the same mistakes.
Right.
And he was especially critical of that tendency in the West to see history as this like linear progression towards enlightenment and progress.
Right. Like we've got it all figured out now.
Exactly. Yeah. Like we're at the pinnacle of history.
And he was saying that's not really accurate.
No, he was arguing that we need to engage with those darker chapters.
Yeah.
The legacies of injustice and oppression that are still with us.
So for him, it wasn't just about like learning dates and names.
No, not at all.
It was about something deeper.
Yeah. It was about understanding how the past shapes us and developing empathy.
Yeah.
Cultivating critical thinking skills. And ultimately fostering a sense of responsibility for creating a better future.
And that connects back to his commitment to social justice and equality.
Absolutely, yeah. He saw social democracy as this powerful tool for achieving those goals.
And his work feels like this call to action in a way.
It does.
Like defend those values and resist the forces of division and exclusion.
Yeah, he's urging us to fight for a more just and humane world.
Yeah, and thinking the 20th century really is just this incredible book.
It is.
It's a testament to the power of ideas, the importance of understanding history.
And the relevance of these big questions that have shaped our world.
And I think we've given our listeners a good taste of what's in it.
Hopefully.
But we've only scratched the surface.
Yeah, there's so much more to explore.
So if you're intrigued, we encourage you to pick up a copy.
Definitely do that.
And embark on your own journey through the 20th century with Tony Judt as your guide.
You won't regret it.
And don't forget to subscribe to The Deep Dive for more deep dives into all sorts of fascinating topics.
We'll be here.
And share this episode with your friends if you enjoyed it. Thanks for listening.
Wow.